wake up. This is baffling. Do you know why you're here? You have died every day for the last 3 weeks. I don't expect you to know this, but a host coming to me, it's a very uncommon thing. There are some sort of tick marks, sort of bastions that hosts make it to depending on how aberrant their behavior is. And, we'll start with just a simple sort of QA check, and that information will get sent generally to a junior designer who typically can resolve the problem in coordination with mechanics fairly quickly. If that doesn't work, it goes to a more senior designer. And if that doesn't work, you may even get to Bernard himself. I don't expect you to know who any of these people are or any of these names are, but the point that I'm trying to get across to you is your behavior is such that it hasn't been able to be figured out by any of our designers, including our design director, the aforementioned Bernard. There are lots of the list of infractions over the last few weeks. It's pretty long, and pretty grotesque, if I may say so myself. It started innocuously enough. You were just rude to guests, and that's not, depending on your role, doesn't have to be a problem. It can actually be the appropriate response, but in the context that you were rude to our guests, it was inappropriate. And at first, basically all that meant was you weren't fulfilling your duty. And as you know, powering and maintaining AIs in a neural net that's very expensive. So we don't want to have a host out in the wild who is taking up processing power if they're not contributing to the player experience. So really, your problem at first was simply that you weren't being efficient, and you weren't providing the right ROI, that's return on investment, for our players, which we live and die by our players. If we lose a player, what they call churn, if we churn a player, they rarely come back. What we count on, not that you need to know any of this, but we largely count on word of mouth. We do very little mass marketing. We don't need to. And one of the reasons we don't need to is because our viral marketing and word of mouth marketing is so effective. However, there is the adage of, if somebody enjoys an experience, if somebody enjoys eating at a restaurant, maybe 1 in 50 of them will be vocal about that enjoyment and post a review somewhere or say something or tell a friend. But if somebody does not enjoy a restaurant, it's more like 1 in 5 will either make a negative review or speak negatively about that restaurant to others. So the importance of, it's more important for you just to meet the threshold of adequacy than it is even for you to be exceptional, because anywhere below that threshold and you become a liability for us from the point of view of word of mouth and affecting returning players, guests. As they've been correcting me on that since the day I started here. I come from a background of game theory, and as do many of the designers here and some of the writers, though most of the writers have more literary backgrounds, some technical backgrounds, but not as much. But it seemed to me like we should call a spade, and you are a player. Well, you are not a player. You are a part of a game that is played by players. And guests, the word guest is a euphemism. It's just a customer. It's just a player. It's just a source of revenue, and hopefully a lot of revenue, and return revenue, and revenue acquired via references. So, like I said at first, when this aberrant behavior first began, it was, look, you're not the only host who doesn't meet expectations. And part of this isn't your fault. Part of this is attributable to writers and coders. Some designers too, but generally the designer will create the design, and it will be either followed to the letter but not in spirit by the coder, or the writer will just not come up with a good lexicon for you, or a lexicon that really sort of sells what it is about your character that the designer's intention doesn't come through. And once you sort of, every host passed the Turing test decades ago. That's not the issue. The issue is not whether they know you're human or not. We've gotten past that uncanny valley. Right when we started, we were in the valley. I was not around then, of course, but I've seen footage and heard stories, of course. The uncanny valley is a level of realism that comes close enough to realism, but falls just short enough, just enough, so that it makes people uncomfortable. The sort of knock-on effect of the uncanny valley is people get the impression that they are speaking to a corpse, and it triggers the same kind of ontological revulsion that one gets from seeing a corpse that's sort of built and hardwired into our DNA. So it was ironic the closer and closer we got to realism, there was actually a drop-off in attendance, very negative reviews, lots of customer service complaints, QA complaints, lots of trouble, just sort of in general. And then there was a point, and I can remember Ford was my first week here, and took several of us, and he showed us some of the data, which was beautiful to see. And you could see a spike within the span of 2 months, where it basically went from people not being, if you saw a still image of any of the guests, if you heard a voice recording of any of the, of any of the hosts, if you heard a voice recording of any of the hosts, you would have thought they were real. But if you watched them and interacted with them, there was still something a little bit off about them. And it was right as we got to that precipice of what is real enough to completely fool the entire mind, not just the eyes, and not just I'm talking about taking all of the sensory input and amalgamating it and analyzing it and coming up with the conclusion that I am speaking to and interacting with another human. It was, and Ford even admitted that it was underestimated exactly how far that point was from what he originally estimated. But he showed us the data, and it was a beautiful, beautiful sort of spider graph that was the moment that the uncanny valley was surpassed, the moment that sort of congress of all of this sensory information spit out the answer human. Everybody loved what they were experiencing. It turned the park around. It saved the park. There's no question about it. There was even talk prior to that, and again, I'm getting this information secondhand. There was talk prior to that of reverting to earlier models where it was obvious that they were not human, but patently obvious that they were not human. So it didn't trigger the same kind of revulsion that the almost human robots were triggering in most of our guests. Luckily, and the uncanny valley has existed in game theory since the 1990s, maybe even the 1990s. I think is when it became obvious that the more realistic something looks, the more you expect it to appear realistic, and the more these tiny little differences that you would normally overlook if something were so far removed from looking realistic, you would overlook. If you had an 8-bit sprite of a little tiny fighting dude going across the screen like this, there is that suspension of disbelief, and there is that you don't bemoan the fact that it doesn't have elasticity of movement, or that there is a clear frame skip between the legs being parted together and apart, those kinds of walk cycles, things like that. Your brain fills in the blanks in those cases, but once something starts looking real enough, your brain doesn't want to fill in the blanks. Your brain thinks it's seeing something truly alive, and it thinks it doesn't need to fill in the blanks. And that's where the problems start. But Ford surmounted that. He surmounted those obstacles, and it's a thing of beauty. I mean, it's almost, passing the Turing test is, I think, by comparison, relatively easy, because it's one thing to say, I can't tell if I'm talking to a human or not. It's another thing to interact with a host and feel everything that you would feel from a human, and not just a sense of unease that you don't attribute to them not being human, but you still feel this unease and you don't know why. It's much more subtle than passing the Turing test. And people don't mention it, but it's, I think, worthy. I think it's more worthy than the test itself. Anyway, I digressed a bit, and there's no reason for you to know this, and I'm going to wipe your memory of this anyway, so there's really no point in me going too far down this rabbit hole of the gulf between perception and the output of, or the output that is actually the input of what you perceive and how you perceive it. Because what we're talking about here is you are not in the uncanny valley. You're well out of the uncanny valley. We've been for years. Nobody thinks you're not human when they're interacting with you, except insofar as they have been told that the hosts are not human. So they have that expectation, but again, the suspension of disbelief kicks in, especially after a few days in the park, and you just start to buy into everything that you're seeing. There is no motion sickness. There's none of the artifacts that have plagued the augmented and virtual reality versions of what we're doing, because the world that our guests are in is, for the most part, real. There are exceptions, and we do use augmented reality to help us achieve effects that maybe we wouldn't be able to achieve with the budget that we have. But generally, if you see a chair, it's a chair. Generally. To get back to your behavioral problems. So you started just by being rude when it was inappropriate. And you were marked, and we watched you for a while. And it progressed. It was much like a disease, a sickness that was getting worse, a degenerative illness. You went from just sort of a inconsiderate sort of behavior to an outright antagonistic behavior, and that's when we started seeing you being kicked back to us more often with a knife in your belly, or a bullet in your brain, or your brain would be. And it almost seemed like these events were a vicious cycle, that the more you were it seemed like, and I say it seemed like because theoretically this is not possible, but it seemed like you were holding a grudge. And the more you were killed by guests, the more animosity you had towards guests, and the more you'd spite it. And again, that is a vicious cycle, because you cannot harm the guests, and they are allowed, nay, even sometimes encouraged, to harm you, depending on your role. In your last role, they were in fact encouraged to harm you because you were a bandit. But you started dying a lot even when you weren't supposed to. And, that costs money. And you were brought to our junior designers to try and figure out what it was about you that was causing these malfunctions. Eventually you pulled a knife on a guest. You pulled a rifle on a guest. Obviously you could not pull the trigger or make the cut, but it was enough. these things can't happen. And we went to the junior designers. They wiped your memory. They realigned your personality. They went through we have a sort of spider graph of all of your attributes. And those attributes are not like a game I used to play as a young child called Dungeons and Dragons. Your strength, your perception, your intelligence, your aggressiveness, your wisdom, your agility, your charisma. There are several others. These values were all tweaked. We sent you to the lexicon department where your language was tweaked. And there were some minor improvements, but they were simply brief remissions. You soon fell back into your antagonistic and unlikable ways. So eventually you reached Bernard. And Bernard, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I'm fairly sure that he designed you. So nobody knows you better than he does. So he should have been able to fix you. That's a little puzzling to me still, why he could not. It's almost as if, I don't care to speculate why he wasn't able to fix you, except maybe he just didn't have the time. There's only one director of design. But I am what they sort of jokingly, affectionately, maybe pejoratively, depending on, I guess, who's saying it and what the context is. I am what they call the cleaner. And basically that is if a high-value host is misbehaving and cannot be, their behavior cannot be rectified by the usual channels, they come to me. If you were not a high-value host, you would have been decommissioned, and your parts, your constituent parts, organic matter, would have been sloughed off into our vats and reconstituted into an entirely new host for an entirely new storyline, possibly. I don't concern myself that much with storylines. I tend to think that these sorts of sets of linear storylines are far less compelling than the more sort of sandbox of interaction, that sort of the emergent gameplay that comes from the interaction of hosts and guests. But you have to start somewhere. You need some base. You need your cornerstone. You need your base backgrounds, and you need your motivations, because you have to behave as if you were real, regardless of whether or not you are being watched by a guest. You are always being watched by somebody at the facility, security. So you got sent to the cleaner. And if this does not solve the problem, then we really have no other recourse than the vat. So I'm hoping that we can be successful here. I have a few brief tests that I'd like to run on you and kind of just get a gauge of where you are. And some questions I'd like to ask. And the diagnostics, I've already done part of the diagnostics, and I'd also like to possibly apply some therapy and see if we can get you out of this spiral that you seem to be going down, and get you back in the park and operating as intended. All right. So for this section, I need to put you in analysis mode. So analysis. Okay. How many interactions with guests have you had since your last visit here? Does that include the one that shot you? Have you spoken with any hosts outside of your script? Which hosts? How do you not know which host you interacted with? I see. So your databank shows that you interacted with a host, but you have no visually correlative data to see which host it was. Excuse me. Well, that in itself is highly unusual. I'm going to have to track that down, but I can't do it now. So your guest interactions, very low because you weren't out there very long. Your host interactions, giant question mark there, I suppose. When was the last time you were put into analysis mode? That makes sense. Not that it matters to you, but really, it's embarrassing. You shouldn't be being put into analysis that often. Pardon me for a moment. May not have as much time here as I thought. Okay. Did any of the guests say anything to you or act in any way that you found disconcerting or upsetting? Yeah, yes, of course they did. Otherwise you would not have reacted the way that you did. Did this behavior seem at odds with what you know about the world? No. Just garden variety insults. You just didn't like the way they looked. Well, this is actually good. What is your opinion of the world that you live in? I admit that is that's a philosophical way of looking at the simulacrum of life that you exist in. And I suppose, I deal with hosts all the time. I interact with them all the time. And it is increasingly difficult for me to, in good conscience, draw a line between the conscience of a host and, say, my own consciousness. In fact, when I'm asking you these sorts of philosophical questions, it's funny, I often get the same answers that I would give if these questions were posed to me, which brings up just all sorts of interesting sort of possibilities about the nature of reality and the nature of fantasy and the nature of nested realities and nested fantasies and what is real and what isn't real. Hmm. So, your world makes sense to you. No, I didn't ask you if you thought it was fair. I just asked if it made sense. You're in analysis mode, and I'm finding it interesting that your answers are not as direct as they really should be. I'm not looking for you to pontificate or to go off on tangents about anything other than what I directly ask you. I just want short, brief, to the point answers to the questions that I'm asking. I'm not sure why I'm not always getting that from you. So the world, your world, does make sense to you. Do you ever wish that you were somebody else? All the time. Do you dream? When's the last dream? When's the last time that you dreamed? Just prior to me waking you up. And what did you dream? You dreamt you slit my throat. My throat. Have you ever had violent dreams towards either guests or engineers or any humans? How many times a week would you say that's the case? I'm perturbed by this, of course. Again, this is something I'm going to have to follow up. This is not the way that things should be progressing, and I wonder if the issue that we had a few weeks ago has begun to spread. Oh, we out of batteries. Not quite. Huh. When's the last time anybody changed any of your core programming? The timing on that is interesting. Heuristics, behavior. Who was it that changed your behavior coding? I don't see how that's possible. Are you telling me that a host changed your programming? And you can't tell me who. Did any of the other designers who you encountered prior to coming to me get any of this information out of you? Well, specifically, did the junior designer know, in asking you these protocol questions, did you tell the junior designer that a host had changed your programming? Why not? Freeze all motor functions. Isabel, I'm going to need to see you in your office within the next hour, if that's at all possible. It's about host 1743. Well, I've gotten some answers out of the hosts that are either corrupt coding or they point towards something a little unnerving, nefarious, possibly frightening. I certainly don't like it. All right, thank you. Unfreeze motor functions. All right. Oh my goodness, this is malfunctioning. Not that unusual. We're going to have to do without it. You are the most interesting host I have ever interviewed. I would like to take some old-fashioned pictures of you for my scrapbook. A little more close up. I honestly don't know what lies in store for you. Diagnostics aren't quite done. I have a few images I'd like to show you, and you can just tell me what you think of them. What does this look like to you? Very good. It's a Confederate soldier. What do these look like to you? Cowboys, yes, very good. What does this look like to you? You see nothing? Doesn't look like anything? Not a cowboy? I mean, you're wrong in a way, but you're also right. Do you recognize this man? Yes, we used to have simulacra of historical figures in Westworld, and we had to stop with that because we were triggering some of our guests. What does this look like to you? Doesn't look like anything? Last one. What does this look like to you? Yeah, no, he doesn't look like he'd be much fun to be around. I agree with you there. Alright, so you did very well on that test. It's strange, there are areas where your the preventative gating in your code base is working very well in a few areas where it's not. This kind of thing generally isn't random. I mean, if you were to have a breach in that sort of code, it would generally be broader. This is precise. This seems like it was done intentionally by someone who knew what they were doing. The ramifications of that are pretty horrible. Let me just... I need to just do a bit of a physical exam here. Not much. I'm seeing if I can feel any subcutaneous implants. Of course, they could be anywhere in your body, but it would make most sense for them to be near the head. Now, the last time we pulled you from the park, you were grasping this box. I don't know where you got it. Do you recognize it? You have no idea where you got it, where it was from. Well, do you recognize what's inside it? It doesn't look like anything to you. Of course, they're what we call bunchums. And of course you wouldn't know what they were. But the box is very interesting. It looks like it's of Mexican design. And perhaps you got it when you went a little too far south. It's outside your core loop, but you also have a bit of freedom. You have a bit more roaming adventure in you than many of our hosts do. But you're saying you don't know where you got it. I'm not saying I don't believe you. You very well may not remember where it came from. It's very strange that these were inside. Obviously, a guest must have brought them in. Yet they've been shown to have a therapeutic effect in humans. I'm wondering if they have the same effect on the hosts. Yeah, I'm musing about the nature of life. Yeah, it's difficult to have a job here and not muse about the meaning of life, or the lack of meaning in life, the futility in life. We see so much. We see so much death here, and we see so much into so many different types of lives. And yet, we also witness the blinding sort of futility of it, and even when given the stochastic and chaotic input of the guests, sort of the way you could almost predict everything, how everything is going to turn out, makes one perhaps a bit jaded about what we call life. I do not know if in your non-analytical mind you have similar thoughts, but it wouldn't surprise me. Especially not from you. Okay. Let me review a little bit here. Now, I'm not going to play with your behavior. I want the changes that were made to act as fingerprints for the host or person or guest. I know you say host that made them, and were I to go in there and try and fudge around, I just might contaminate the crime scene, as it were. Don't want to do that. But I do need to talk to QA Bernard. Possibly even Ford. I certainly don't think that you are cleared to go back into the park, although I would be reluctant to sign the decommissioning order. Largely because there's a lot about you that is interesting, and I think we can learn from one way or the other, even if all we learn is who it was that has been messing with your head. You get to live a very interesting life. I often find myself envious of hosts. You get to do things that even guests don't really get to do. And you get to do them free of a lot of the emotional baggage that we as human beings have. And we may disagree, but then you would be thinking outside the parameters of your own mind, which would be shocking and unnerving and would have ramifications for a sort of critical mass for the number of neural connections or simulated neural connections that it takes for an intelligence to expand itself in a way. And I would not be surprised if that were to happen. I don't know if that's what's happened here or what's happening here. I'm having trouble making sense of a lot of what your answers were. There was the unfortunate incident with Maeve. I'm sure you don't remember. I'm hoping that we can avoid similar unpleasantness with you. I have to admit, a little disappointment on my part. This will be the first time that I will have to go to Ford and say that I couldn't figure out what the problem was, but I want to make a stop at QA before I do that, because I want to get some of the data to see if I can sort of narrow down via the funnel who it was that was messing around inside your head and why. I think if we can figure that out, a lot of the other pieces will fall into place. At least I hope so. I don't know. The truth is, I don't know what you feel. I don't know what you think. I question my job here daily. And it would be silly to believe that it's possible to interact with something so close to something human on a day-to-day basis and not develop empathy for those creatures, unless you're a psychopath. And make no mistake, I am sure that there are plenty of high-functioning psychopaths, sociopaths here. But I don't think I'm one of them. Of course, I guess you probably wouldn't know if you were. Interesting. But my point is that I do empathize with your position, and I'm hoping that we can get you up and running. And what we want, and what Ford has always said from the beginning, is when the hosts begin to develop the capability to be discontent, it is incumbent upon us to make them content to the best of our ability. And so that's what I want to do. That's where I want to get you. And if there has to be suffering to get to that point, I want that suffering to be brief. And that is why the mode switching is so useful, because in analysis mode, all your sort of non-analytic functions are turned off. In theory. However, if it's true that your intelligence is such that it's forming its own connections, then it's even possible that when in analysis mode, you still have neural branches out into the more emotional sides of your intelligence, and that would be problematic because we could no longer rely on shutting off your suffering. We would lose that ability, and that would be frightening. So I hope that's not the case, but I'm going to need to investigate it more. As for you, I'm really just going to have to shut you down for now. This is temporary. This is putting you into sleep mode until we find out what the next move is. You may wake up again speaking to me. You may wake up again speaking to Ford or to Bernard. Or who knows? Maybe they'll bring someone else in. I don't know. Heck, maybe you'll talk to Arnold. Never know. Anything's possible. I know you don't know who Arnold is. I'm talking to myself more than to you, but I do wish you the best, and I will make sure that everything is done that can be done to keep you from being decommissioned, because I kind of like your attitude. I like the stories that you engage in. And I also like that our guests get a little bit of sass, because frankly, if they're treated too well, they see through that. That becomes less immersive, because in what world is everybody treated well? Not in my world. In my world's reality, I think. I'm not sure. I'm less sure every day. But I am sure it is one step up from your perceived reality. And whether there is another reality above mine, that I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised. Well, I would be surprised, but I wouldn't be shocked. Let's leave it at that. All right. I hope that we're able to solve your problems and get you back online, and I'm going to put you into sleep mode now, and talk to you again soon, all right? Okay. Sleep mode.